The Tower of London is remembered in history as one of the most brutal and barbaric prisons, and there was one entrance in particular that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who arrived at the tower accused of some of the most serious crimes. Many people were brought into the fortress for their imprisonment or torture, and they would be executed on Tower Hill. Execution within the walls of the tower was reserved for people who were of royalty or of incredibly high status. For example, 2 of Henry VIII's wives lost their heads in the private of the tower, away from the eyes of the public, as did a favourite of Elizabeth I, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. However, many of these people were accused of treason, and they were often brought to the tower downriver, as the River Thames gave direct access to the tower. There was, of course, no trains or cars in the 16th century, so the river became a major source of traffic, and when people were brought to the tower, they often passed under the heads of executed traitors and criminals, which were placed above London Bridge on pikes. But the entrance they were brought into would become known as Traitor's Gate. But it was never intended to be an entrance for some of the most high-profile prisoners in Tower's history. To begin with, Traitor's Gate had no association with prisoners or executed people, but instead it had associations with royalty and kings and queens. The Tower of London was, and still is, a royal fortress, and it was where traditionally kings and queens during the medieval period would stay before their coronations took place. They would then be paraded to Westminster Abbey for their coronation. However, Traitor's Gate was created in the 13th century. It was created by a medieval architect known as Master James of St. George, and he had been tasked by King Edward I around 1275 with making a new private entrance to the Tower of London. Edward wanted more privacy when it came to travelling to the Tower to stay, and this was also a safety aspect at play for the medieval kings and queens. London in the medieval period was a dirty place where diseases such as the plague and smallpox would ravage the population. The streets were often filled with mess and dirt, and it was actually safer for the king to travel into the Tower of London from his other palaces by the River Thames, and he would also avoid the crowds, meaning there was less chances of assassination, but also less chance of catching diseases and illness. The Tower of London was where the king's court would also be, and many of these courtiers lived in luxury, and big banquets would take place. So a new Watergate was commissioned to help the king get to the Tower, and it was a time in which the Tower was seen as a lavish fortress, and it did not have the reputation it has now as a place of torture, execution and brutality. It was seen in the same light as Buckingham Palace is today, and the Tower during the Tudor period became more of a royal prison, especially during the reign of Henry VIII. The Tower would be the place where infamous torture devices such as the rack were used, and where many royal prisoners would be held in the many different towers and turrets which were surrounded by the River Thames. These rooms were often very dark and damp, and during the Tudor period there was a huge influx of people who were brought to the Tower who were accused of the most serious crime of treason. A lot of these prisoners were brought into the fortress through the former Watergate, commissioned by Edward I. And then this is why the entrance became known as Traitor's Gate. They would be brought under London Bridge and then into the Tower, where they were received by the lieutenant of the Tower, a man who was in charge of their imprisonment. During the reign of the Tudor kings and queens, a large number of political prisoners were brought to the Tower, mostly due to the changes in laws and rules in the land, and these prisoners who were brought to the Tower, including Edward the Duke of Buckingham, Sir Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Edward Seymour the Duke of Somerset, and Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. Most of these were taken into the Tower through Traitor's Gate, and they came through the Watergate, but it's believed for some time that Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII, went through Traitor's Gate, but this was not the case. When Anne was brought to the Tower for her imprisonment, she actually disembarked her barge and climbed up the steps onto Tower Wharf, which became known as the Queen's Steps. She then entered through the board tower, and she then asked William Kingston, the constable of the tower who greeted her, "Shall I go to the dungeon?" And Kingston answered with, "No, madam, you shall go to your chambers, whereat your grace lay before your coronation." Anne Boleyn was held inside of the Queen's lodgings, and she was treated very well, and she was appointed a number of women to serve her. But Henry VIII did not have her taken into the Tower through Traitor's Gate, but she was affected by the psychological effect of her imprisonment at the Tower. It was said that she had bouts of hysteria and depression, but more enemies of the king would be taken into the Tower by the Watergate. The barges would signal to the guards to open Traitor's Gate before the barge would then be allowed into the Tower. The boatmen also had to consider the tides at this time too, and how quickly the Thames could change in its tidal direction. The prisoner, once in the Watergate, would then walk up the steps into the Tower below St Martin's, the Tower, the former royal residence. However, one of the most famous prisoners held inside of the Tower would be forced to go through Traitor's Gate, and this had a profound effect on her. Elizabeth I, at the time when she was a princess, was taken through the gate to intimidate her. She was accused of being involved in rebellions against her half-sister Mary I. Elizabeth was taken on Palm Sunday 1554 on the Thames, and she was taken through Traitor's Gate and into the very place where her mother had been executed. She believed she would never be able to escape the Tower, and that she would spend the rest of her history dead underneath the floor of the chapel in the Tower, just like her mother. Elizabeth I, when Traitor's Gate was opened, refused to land at the gate and said that she was not a traitor, but due to the heavy rainfall, she had to land there. She went through the archway of the bloody Tower following landing, and she was complaining about being a prisoner at the Tower, and she protested her innocence. But as she walked up towards the White Tower, the oldest part of the fortress, she would see the scaffold, which was now decrepit, where her mother would lose her head on. This was all psychological torture for the Queen, and with this she was then held inside of the bell tower. But she would be interrogated many times, accused of being complicit in trying to bring down her half-sister's regime. But she would never have anything proven against her, and she was considered a skilled and intelligent woman who forced her release. But Traitor's Gate, for many of those held inside of the Tower during the Tudor period, was the first step in the execution of these prisoners held there. The prisoners who were taken there would then be given a prison cell, depending on their status and crime. The degree of treatment they would get at the Tower was varied and would depend on whether they were due to be tortured or not, and whether information needed to be extracted. The vast majority of those taken through Traitor's Gate would be taken to Tower Hill, where they lost their heads on the public beheading spot by axe, or they were taken to the journey across London to Tyburn, where they were hanged, drawn and quartered. Tower Hill, though, was just a short walk from the Tower's walls, and if someone was condemned here, they would be taken by guards to the execution block and the scaffold where thousands of people would look on. Traitor's Gate was the first step in the horror and brutal process, and there were many times when a prisoner's remains, following execution, were then brought back into the Tower's walls and were buried inside of the Tower's chapel. In the vaults here are the remains of many important Tudor people, including Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More, but Traitor's Gate was the first stop in this, and today it still remains an ominous part of the Tower of London's history. Thank you for watching, and as support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.